Good evening, and welcome to the Forestry Fall Webinar Series. My name is Billy Thomas. I'm an Extension Forester here in the Department of Forestry on the campus of the University of Kentucky. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. If this is your first time joining us on the webinar series, welcome aboard. And if you've been with us before, we're glad to have you back. Before we get started with tonight's webinar, a couple of housekeeping items. If you'll notice in the left-hand corner of the screen, the upper left-hand corner of the screen, there's a pod that is labeled Files. You can download a number of files in there, including the handout for tonight's presentation, an evaluation, and a number of other forestry-related topics that you might be of interest. We're going to handle questions through the chat pod. It's in the lower left-hand corner. So if you have questions tonight, please use that and type in the questions there, and we'll try to get to those as quick as we can. Tonight, we've got two presenters going to be talking about a very important subject. We're going to be talking first with Dr. Jeff Stringer here. Jeff is a extension forester, extension professor in the Department of Forestry. Jeff, you were with us last week talking about federally protected species. Right. But this week, we've got an interesting topic that we hear a lot about is woodland health.
Forest health.
Yeah. So it's tell us a little bit about what we're going to hear tonight.
Yeah. So we're going to be talking about help you evaluate the health of your woodlands to determine whether the trees in are healthy and the woodlands is working like it should. Is it naturally regenerating, native species, those kind of things. So we'll be talking about how to holistically, if you will, or look at your whole woodlands, determine its health, and then we'll be talking about various things that can affect forest health, insect diseases, invasive plants, all that kind of thing. So we're going to cover a lot of ground.
Excellent. You know, I mean, I hear a lot from landowners about woodland health and issues associated with it, and I think it has different meanings for different folks. So I think it's going to be great to get a great overview. And a little later on, we're going to be bringing in another presenter, Dr. Ellen Crocker, and we'll introduce her a little more formally later. But tonight, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Jeff. And again, thank you all so much. We appreciate you all spending the day with us, and we appreciate the county extension agents for serving as hosts. If you are happen to watch this recording, thanks for watching the recording. And I will say we do have all the recordings posted on our website, and you can check it out there. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to Jeff. And again, thank you all for being with us tonight. Jeff, thank you so much.
Okay. Thanks, Billy. And so we're going to be talking about woodlands health tonight, and we have a lot of articles in the Kentucky Woodlands magazine, and hopefully many of you get this, but we just about every issue we've got something where we're talking about forest health in there. So that's a good resource for you on a number of these different things. So we'll go to the PowerPoints now and start going through the slides. And first of all, we're going to spend just a few minutes here in talking about what we're going to do tonight. And so what is woodland health? We're going to cover that. We're actually going to define what woodland health is. It sounds simple, but may not be quite as simple as it sounds. And then what are the characteristics of healthy woodlands and how to evaluate them. And as we mentioned before, when Billy was in here, we're talking about some common woodland health threats. And then in the end, we'll talk a little bit about strategies to improve or maintain woodland health. So we're going to cover, as I indicated before, we're going to cover a lot of waterfront. And we should be able to provide you with some idea of how to evaluate the health of your woodlands, or at least get you started in that direction. So one of the things we want to talk about is what is woodland health. So I'll present you with the definition here. That is, it's woods that contain and can regenerate and maintain a natural diversity of native tree, shrub, and ground layer species appropriate for site and soils present. Now, so I'm going to try to, if I can, I'm going to highlight some words here that are kind of important, okay? And first of all, we've got the word in here, regenerate, okay? So we're not only going to be talking about whether your woods is healthy or not, not only looking at the trees that are there, that are standing there now, which certainly is important, but can that woods regenerate itself? So that's a process, okay? So we're going to talk about the fact that a woods that's healthy has the ability to regenerate itself, okay? And it's going to regenerate itself with a natural diversity of native tree species. So obviously natives are important in this, and so we want a diversity of tree species that are present, and we want them to be able to regenerate. Now, this not only deals with the trees, but also the shrub and the ground layer species. So when we think about woodland health, you just don't want to be thinking about your overstory or your canopy trees. You have to be thinking about, the entirety from the roof of the forest at the canopy all the way down to the ground layer. Okay, and of course, what should be there are things that are important to be growing and appropriate to be growing on the sites and soils that are present there. Okay, so I hope that makes sense to you, and we'll kind of elucidate some of this as we go through. Now, there are differing opinions on how this definition is interpreted and applied. Okay, and a lot of those opinions are kind of based, on your objectives. So what might be a healthy woods to one person may not be to another, and I'll explain that here in a minute. But there will be an opinion that may differ a little bit in your personal definition of health. Okay, so and let me give you some examples of that. To some of you, having a healthy woods may in fact mean that your individual trees that are in your overstory are vigorous and they're vibrant and they're growing rapidly. Okay, and for timber objectives, this is usually a pretty good thing. So if you kind of have that mindset, or your thought about woodland health revolves around having very vigorous overstory trees, for example, the canopy is contiguous, meaning there's no holes or gaps in it, right? Individual overstory trees are growing vigorously, and understory can regenerate overstory species. And what I mean by that is a lot of times we have oak woodlands, and we'd like to keep our woods in oak. We'd like to make sure that those woods can continue to regenerate some oak in it, so that woods has to be able to regenerate the oak species that are currently in the overstory. So a definition like this would be something that somebody might use that was interested in that vigorous growth. However, there may be some of you that may take a more another view, I guess, of your woodlands and the objectives for it, and you may be trying to grow old growth, or you may be saying, hey, whatever Mother Nature does as far as growth and development of that woods over time, I'm fine with. Okay, and so you might have an old growth objective, for example. Now, in the case of old growth, you may get, and in fact will get, canopy trees, major large canopy trees that could be in decline. So they're not of high vigor because they're naturally getting ready to die off due to old age. And that will cause openings to occur in the canopy. And so in that case, you're fine with overstory trees that are not growing rapidly or they're not vigorous because they're declining due to natural processes, natural old age, things of that nature. And so that's maybe fine with you. And can woods do that? Okay. One question is, can those woods replace themselves with other native species or not? And so there still is a working definition here that you have to think about relative to even managing for something like old growth. And we'll give some examples of this as we go through. So let's talk about this just a little bit more to kind of reinforce this. Let's think about a woods, if you will, from the standpoint of starting out with a bunch of newly regenerating seedlings and saplings. So you might have a group, what we call make a group opening, for example, in your woodlands, maybe an acre in size or something. Cut all the trees in that little 1 acre area, and new regeneration springs up off the forest floor. So the new saplings coming from seed and sprouts and that kind of thing. So the woods will start out. Of course, all those trees start to grow. Now they're a little larger, 1 or 2 inches diameter, sapling size, and they continue to grow. And you'll notice here, and when we popped up this next graph here, figure, that now you have trees starting to grow in underneath those overstory trees that are starting to get maybe 30 and 40 foot tall, that kind of thing. And of course, as the woods ages, those overstory trees, of course, get bigger. You get different trees starting to emerge underneath. And at some point, it becomes what we call economically mature, 16, 18, 20, 22, 24 inches in diameter, where the overstory trees are still vigorous. They're still putting on diameter growth. They're still putting on volume growth for those of you that are interested in timber. Now, if you let the situation go on, though, some of those trees will start to naturally decline. Okay, now, and that woods will start to hit biological maturity, which simply means that the overstory trees are starting to get to the point where they're naturally dying off. Some trees, and we'll talk about this a little later, some trees have long lifespans, some have short. Okay, and so we'll talk a little bit about that. Now, let's look at this latter situation just a little bit more. So here was the figure I had up where all the overstory trees were growing vigorously. They were, they were of good size now. You had different species underneath, some different sizes of trees and ages of trees underneath. So if you let that go, of course, you get some trees that will naturally die. Now, if you don't harvest or anything, you're just letting the Mother Nature work, those trees would, become a snag and of course then fall over, and that leaves a gap in the canopy. So now you have a discontiguous canopy. And there's nothing wrong with that. Okay, from a timber production standpoint, you're losing volume when you let that happen, and value and those kind of things. But if you're not interested in it, that's fine. Because what that does is actually develops what's called a complex canopy structure. So an old growth forest have a complex canopy structure. They have holes and gaps where older trees are dying. Other trees are starting to replace. So if you let this go on, you will get replacement of that gap in there as other overstory trees die. These gaps move around. Now the trees that replace them may be a different species than the overstory tree. You may go from an oak-dominated woods to a maple-dominated woods over time. And that's okay because that's a natural process. So if you're into managing and just allowing Mother Nature to do her thing, you're managing for old growth, this is what's going to happen. And as long as that all those processes can occur and are not interfered with, that woods could be termed healthy. So what is healthy depends upon, again, kind of your ownership objectives and the way you view your woods. Now, regardless of whether you're dealing with old growth and you're managing for that, or whether you're wanting to keep your woods fairly vigorous and fast growing, no matter what, there is a commonality here. So woods that currently contain and can regenerate and maintain a natural diversity of native trees, shrubs, and ground layer species appropriate for the site and soils present. If your woods is doing that, then I would view it as being healthy. Some woods can grow faster than others, in volume growth and size and diameter, compared to where they're at. One soil, some soils will generate faster growth than others. Some site conditions, the top of the ridge is going to be slower than at the bottom, and that kind of thing. But if you can look at your woods and it contains and can regenerate natural diversity of native tree, shrub, and ground layer species that are appropriate for where it's at, then I would say your woods is healthy. So let's talk about how to evaluate things just for a minute. So one way to do this, an easy way, is to kind of divide your woods vertically into your overstory trees or your canopy trees, and then into what's underneath, which is what we call midstory. Those are those gray trees that you see there, and shrub and forest floor. So shrub is what's in your face, 5, 10, 15 foot tall, and then the forest floor, that's what's actually down on the ground layer. So you can analyze and assess your woods by okay, first let's analyze what's going on with our canopy trees, and then let's analyze what's going on down at the ground. That's kind of a good way to break it out. Okay, so first of all, the question would be does your overstory have native species or not? Now, most everybody's overstory does. I mean, you do get a few situations where you'll get things like tree of heaven or Polonia that are mature, large overstory trees. We've at our research forest in eastern Kentucky, we had 2 tree of heaven in one spot that were almost 90 foot tall and over 3 foot in diameter. So some of these invasive species we've eradicated them, by the way, but some of those invasive species like that can be overstory species. But most of our woodlands do have the native species present. Now, let's analyze those overstory trees that are there, those native species. If you've got individuals there that are starting to lose major canopy branches. So these are not branches that are down low. These are major branches that are up in the canopy, and you see your overstory tree starting to lose those major branches. Then that's a cause for a little bit of concern, because those trees certainly are losing vigor. Okay. Now, obviously, the picture here shows dead and dying canopy trees, so you can assess the vigor of your canopy by some very obvious things, such as do we have major branches dying out up there, or they're dead or dying canopy trees. Okay. Now, there's another issue associated with the canopy trees as well. Now, trees that are really vigorously growing and ones that we say have lots of vigor are going to have nice crowns, the crowns of the individual trees in the overstory are going to be nice and they're balanced, which means they got 3 or 4 sides. They're expanding out from the bole. If you look up at them, if you're standing at the bottom of the tree and look up at it, 3 or 4 sides that are spanning, nice and balanced. So here you see this happens to be a black walnut. This is an overstory tree, and you can see that nice big round, well-balanced crown. And that means that tree has plenty of individual room to grow for that individual tree. You can get in woods where the trees aren't dying, there's no dieback yet, there's no major branches being lost, those kind of things, but their crowns are small and spindly. And I'll show you a picture. So this is a picture. You can see that crown up there is flattened on a couple sides. It's actually on the back side of it, so there's no crown there at all. So it's got a 3-sided crown, and it's definitely compressed on 2 sides. Now, the reason you see clear sky around is because we have taken trees out so you can see that individual tree crown. But that is not a well-balanced crown. So what does that tell you about? Well, that particular woods is too crowded. The density of overstory trees is high enough to where it's decreasing the vigor of the individual trees that are left. So if keeping vigorous trees is important to you from a forest health perspective, and particularly overstory trees, that wood could use some thinning in it to allow the individual trees that are left room to grow a nice crown, get a lot of leaf area, and start growing well. So you can analyze your overstory trees from a number of different perspectives. Okay. Now, your overstory trees also have a bottom to them. So if you think about the bottom of the tree, you can analyze the bottom of the tree and you look at it and see if there's any problems down there. Obvious ones are like what we'll see here. This is where we've got a lot of burrowing and misconfigured growth at the bottom of a red oak tree. They could be hollow, they could be wounded from past logging or fire. So this would come into your assessment as well. Okay. And then what about your understory? Okay, you can assess it. Are saplings and seedling presence of native species? Okay, I'll give you a couple examples here, kind of to give you some things to think about. So if you look at this road right here, you got woods on both sides, and they look vastly different. You look at the road, the one on the right, there's a lot of small stems in there, that kind of thing. On the left, there's less than that. Now, if we look at the woods on the left, or we look out in the woods on the left, this is what you see. And when you look at it, you go, man, that woods look good. It's got big trees in it. There's some white oak there, that kind of thing. It looks good. But look and notice, there is no regeneration on the ground. I mean, nothing. You got leaves down there. You got no small seedlings, no shrub layer, nothing. Okay? And that's because this woodland had been grazed. So the grazing has stopped the native species from being able to establish their natural regeneration. So that woods has an issue because the overstory is fine, but the understory ground layer is not doing well. In this case, it was due to grazing. So what you'd like to see is a bunch of native species. These are oaks, several different oak species. There's some chestnut oak in there and some other species. So if your ground is littered with things like this, that's a good thing because that's a native species coming in. Okay, so those are native oaks. Compared to this right here, so you see this, well, there's lots of green down there, but unfortunately that happens to be garlic mustard, and that's an invasive. And you can get invasives at times that are significant enough down to the forest floor that can stop the regeneration of your native species. So you can, bottom line is, you can analyze this forest floor. And here's a situation that's a bottomland in western Kentucky that is full of a grass down there, okay? And this is Japanese stilt grass. And in a bottomland site, it can take over and literally choke native seedlings out. So you can assess, when you think about woodland health, you want to assess not only the overstory, but what's going down at the ground level. Now, so that gives you some idea about when I'm walking out through the woods, those are kind of the things I'm thinking about. You know, I'm assessing the vigor and what's going on in the overstory. I'm assessing what's going on in the midstory, what's down at the ground at the forest floor. Is that woods regenerating or not? So now there are specific threats that can harm individual trees and ultimately woodlands. So we've got Ellen Crocker's coming to studio right now, and so we'll get her on screen here. It takes a second. So Ellen, welcome here this evening.
Thank you.
And appreciate you coming and being able to share a little bit with us.
Pleasure to be here.
Yeah. So Ellen, Dr. Crocker is a postdoctoral scholar here at the University of Kentucky Department of Forestry. She's working specifically on forest health, and she's been gracious enough to come in tonight and talk to us just a little bit about what's going on. So we want to go ahead and get started.
Wonderful. Sounds
so
good.
we'll go back to the slides here, and I'll turn it over to you.
So as Jeff mentioned, there are a lot of different signs that you can use when you're in your woodland to look for potential forest health problems. And what I'm going to be talking about next is a few of the common woodland health threats that may in some part be causing those things or kind of contributing to the woodland health problems. So we're going to be talking about invasive plants, as well as invasive insects and diseases, especially a problem right now with emerald ash borer just coming into this area a few years ago. And then briefly touch on the damage that can be caused by disturbances, so degraded soils, trees, and understories, as well as human-caused overstory decline. So to begin with, I just want to give an overview of what invasive species are. We talk a lot about them and kind of what are the common threads and why are they so problematic. So in these pictures here, you've got bush honeysuckle on the top, an invasive plant, and the emerald ash borer on the bottom. And when we think about invasives, they're typically non-native. So they're from somewhere else. They're outside of their natural range, and this is usually because of a human introduction. So for some reason, people have brought them there. They, in the case of many plants, thought that they would be great ornamentals, or perhaps accidentally introduced them with wooden packaging material, as is thought to be the case with emerald ash borer. And even in some cases, you can have native invasives, and those are due to some change in the environment or the landscape. Something that had previously been kept in one area is going to be spreading out of it. And that's another characteristic of these invasives, that they're range expanding. They can spread rapidly, they can grow aggressively, outcompete the native plants that are present, and have a big problematic effect. So this could be ecologically or economically. So if we're thinking about a lot of the non-native species that we have in this area, many of them we value. So honeybees, for example, they're not native, but they're also not considered invasive because they're beneficial. Invasives are having some negative effect. And in many cases, this is because the native plants, the native environment is not adapted to them. While our native trees can tolerate disease and insects from the native range, some of these invasives have kind of different approaches, different strategies. They can really do far more damage. So let's look at invasive plants. As Jeff mentioned, one of the big reasons that they're problematic in woodlands is that they crowd out native species and prevent regeneration. So in this example, I'm just going to be talking about bush honeysuckle and showing a few pictures of it because it's one of the most common invasive plants in this area. And as you can see from this picture, that dense understory growth, not a lot is going to get through there. It's keeping light from getting to plants on the ground floor, as well as water, and not letting seedlings grow up or kind of the native herbaceous species thrive. So here's another picture of a bush honeysuckle, just so you can see how dense it's growing. And in this picture, this is just showing in the summer, the fall, and the winter, it's producing these really dense shrubby growth. And one thing to notice that's another commonality in a lot of these invasive plant species is in that fall picture you can see some bright red berries. I'm sure you've seen them out in your woodlands. Unfortunately, we have a lot of bush honeysuckle and it's producing a lot of berries. So those berries are really favored by our birds, and they can be eaten, taken somewhere far away, and rapidly distributed that way. So that's how it's getting around, that's how it's spreading. And that's pretty common for a lot of different invasive species. So just to run through a few of the invasive plants that are common in Kentucky, you've got a number of different dense shrubs. So in addition to bush honeysuckle, you've got winged burning bush, autumn olive, pictured here. And both of those also produce red berries that birds really like and will spread around. They also, as with the other invasive plant species I'll be talking about, crowd out the natives, prevent regeneration. So you've also got some invasive trees. Jeff already mentioned a few of these. Tree of Heaven, and Callery Pear, Princess Tree or Paullinia. Several invasive vines. Here pictured, you've got winter creeper and Japanese honeysuckle. There's also kudzu. And then some invasive grasses and herbaceous species. Chinese silvergrass or miscanthus, garlic mustard, and I've got a little star next to garlic mustard here because so far we've talked about the negative impact that invasive plants can have because they're preventing regeneration. In addition to that, some species, like garlic mustard, actually emit toxic chemicals in the soil that can inhibit the growth of invasives, prevent their ability to absorb nutrients from the soil, and can be problematic in this different pathway. So these are just a few of the invasive plants that are common in our area and have the potential to negatively affect the health of your woodlands. Next, I want to talk about some of the invasive insects and diseases. For the most part, these are problematic because they weaken or kill large numbers of trees. Jeff mentioned earlier that individual tree death is a perfectly natural part of woodlands, especially if you're kind of going for an old growth woodland. You're going to have dead and dying trees. It's a natural part of their life cycles. Where it gets problematic is when there's large numbers of dead trees, perhaps as is the case right now with emerald ash borer, an entire species is really being eliminated. And certainly native insects and diseases can hurt trees, can occasionally kill them, can cause damage, but these invasives can do so to a much higher level, more of an epidemic style effect on our native trees. And so that's why we're talking about them in particular. So one of the ways that invasive insects and diseases can weaken and kill trees is by cutting off their food supply. So for that, I'm going to use the example of the emerald ash borer. Pictured here, you've got an adult emerald ash borer just getting ready to emerge in the spring. It had been a larvae growing in that tree. And what it's doing is the adults lay eggs in the bark, and then larvae are going to grow in that inner bark area and feed off of the tree. They're going to pupate over winter and then emerge in the spring as adults and kind of continue this cycle. And the reason I want to point this out is that where the damage is happening, where the damage to the tree is happening, is actually just at that larval stage for the most part. So while you may not notice it, it's happening underneath the bark. That's when that emerald ash borer is taking the food, taking the resources from that tree and eventually killing it. So that's another reason why, unfortunately, with so many of these invasive insects and pathogens, one of the reasons why they're really hard to detect, especially early on, is that you may not be seeing the damage until it's too late. So if you're looking for those characteristic D-shaped adult emergence holes like you see in that photo on the lower left side, you can see kind of the adults emerging from them. By that point, there's likely already extensive larval damage inside the tree. And that's what's killing the tree. So in addition to these invasive insects and diseases cutting off the food supply, they can also drain tree resources. And that's what's happening with the hemlock woolly adelgid. It's another insect, but unlike the emerald ash borer and some of the other invasive beetles, where the larvae is causing the problems, the hemlock woolly adelgid, the adults actually feed on the tree and drain its resources. So here you can see those fuzzy little white things are actually the hemlock woolly adelgids, and they're draining the resources. They're also injecting some toxins into the tree and killing those hemlocks. So another kind of woodland health threat to be thinking about is degraded woodlands, and this could be degraded soils, trees, understory plants, caused by different disturbances. So this might be arson, forest fire, different woodland abuses, so poor logging practices, and all of these, particularly if they're done repeatedly or not managed, can decrease the health of your woodlands. Another thing that Jeff touched on earlier is that woodlands, forest trees, when they get older, are going to start declining. So if you're thinking about a old growth forest, you're going to have some trees, some individuals that are aging. But as long as you have a diversity of different ages, this might not be a problem. However, if you've got an even age forest, a lot of trees that are on the upper end of their lifespan, they could all kind of be declining at the same time, and this could cause proliferation of different native insects and diseases. These are things that, are always present in the area, are usually not a big problem unless the tree is already weakened in some way. So on this slide you can see a table that has some of the average lifespans of a few common tree species, and you can imagine if you're getting kind of past that for many of the trees in your woodland, they might become susceptible to things like this armillaria root rot, a fungal disease that's endemic where we live. It's native here, but especially as trees age, can become more problematic. So moving on, we're going to talk a little bit more about some strategies that you can use to improve woodland health, to counteract some of these threats that we just mentioned. So Jeff is coming back in with me, and he'll be talking about these.
So one of the things you can do, and this would make sense if you think back to when we started this, and that's the issue of diversity. So what happens is, and Ellen's already described several insects and disease pathogen, whatever, that attacks certain species, like emerald ash borer is a good example. So if you've got a woods that's predominantly one species, you are subject to having an issue, especially if there's something that comes up that causes a decline in that. Okay, so maintaining diversity, so a number of different oak species and poplar and all that, and ash and hickory and everything, is a great idea for a lot of different reasons. And I might mention real quick that maintaining high diversity is good for forest health standpoint, especially when things are changing. Invasives coming in, insect diseases, all those kind of things that can attack an individual species. So having the diversity really helps you there. Okay, but it also can help you with little things like you can deal with like timber markets. Now this has nothing to do with forest health, but the diversity can help you with things like as markets go up and down for different species. If you've got a diversity of species in your woods, you're always going to be able to tie into timber markets as things change over time. So diversity helps you all the way around. And what really cool thing about Kentucky is we have a high degree of diversity in our woods. Most woods have a great degree of, maybe 10 or 15 or 20 or even 30 different overstory species in them. So that really bodes well for you being able to do this, So and diversity is important not only from the standpoint of your overstory trees like we were talking about, but also in your regeneration. So when you regenerate, you'd love to be able to regenerate a diversity of species, and normally this does occur. Sometimes you can do things in a way where you'll have you may have a really good quality site, for example, and you put a regeneration cut in, and all of a sudden you can gain a whole lot more yellow poplar than you had, and lose some of your oaks. So foresters can help you through that, and we're going to talk about a little bit in the end here about where to get assistance on some of this stuff. So think in terms of diversity is one thing you can do to help with forest health overall, both in the overstory and when you go to regenerate. Okay, so we talked about maintaining canopy vigor, of course, a few minutes ago. I talked about it from the standpoint of analyzing the vigor, the different crowns of the trees, that kind of thing. Ellen presented different ages and that kind of thing, and brought that into the picture as well. So, obviously invasives are an issue as well.
Yeah, and that can relate to what Jeff was just mentioning. When you're thinking about strategies to deal with invasives in your woodlands, there are a few things you want to be keeping in mind. First and foremost, scouting for invasives in your area. Knowing what are the invasive species that are the most problematic and looking for them. And once you've got a good grasp of what's out there, where it is and how it's affecting your woodlands, if it's problematic, you probably want to be developing a plan to eradicate current invasives if possible. And so in this photo, you can see an example of both mechanical removal, so cutting, and then herbicide treatment of bush honeysuckle right there. And I say if possible because with a lot of invasive plants, you're going to want to try to eradicate them from your woodlands. But with some of the invasive insects and diseases we talked about, that's just not going to be feasible. Unfortunately, while you can treat individual trees, it's going to be really cost prohibitive and not possible on a large scale. So especially with those invasive insects and diseases, but even with the plants, the next important step is going to be planning for and protecting against future invasions. So unfortunately, these invasions are going to keep happening. It's going to continue to be a feature of what needs to be done to maintain woodland health. So this could involve both planning for the future, so looking for and continued scouting of invasives in your area, keeping informed about new invasives as they come in. And it could also mean protecting against future invasions as far as when you know there's going to be a disturbance in your woodland, planning as far as what's going to come up after that disturbance. So right now with emerald ash borer taking out a lot of ash trees, what many people are seeing is that as the canopy opens up, invasives in the understory are really taking off. So if you know that some disturbance is coming your way, be it an insect pest like emerald ash borer or a harvesting operation, planning ahead to make sure invasives don't take over after that.
And of course, there's always situations that we get into where the woodlands are degraded. So this is because generally some past abuse, whether some bad logging's gone on where they've beat up the overstory trees that were left, the residual trees, that kind of thing. Could be wildfires got in. We talk about trespass here, so that's where, you can have different things happen to your woods, including illegal logging, right? That can happen. So, yeah, you want to try to, as a woodland owner, you want to try to protect yourself from those as best you can. Wildfire, there are things, if you're in a wildfire prone area, and some of you aren't, that's great, and some of you may be, but you can do some things to help prevent the spread of a wildfire onto your property. We'll talk a little bit more how you can get the forester assistance to do this, but you can put in fire lanes, those kind of things to help you with that kind of thing. And of course, it's always good, if you're a woodland owner, you're concerned about your woods, you need to have the boundaries marked for a lot of different reasons, okay? Now, that's not going to somebody wants to trespass on you is going to do it. There's not much you can do about it. We understand that. But not having your boundaries marked certainly leaves you open for a lot of issues, some of which would go away if you had the boundary marked. So Ellen talked about overstory decline, being able to evaluate the age of the woods, and this is where you need some help with some of this. With foresters, a lot of times we know when the overstory, we talked a little bit before about the overstory breaking up and that kind of thing, emerald ash borer coming in. Let's say your woods has 20% of the trees in the overstory for those of you who live in northern Kentucky. And those of you who live in some other places that haven't had emerald ash borer hit yet, but you got a lot of ash. So that's going to open that overstory up, and that's going to cause things to happen underneath. Now, if you have an invasive like bush honeysuckle underneath, like they do in northern Kentucky and places in central Kentucky, what you're going to do is you're going to increase the vigor of that bush honeysuckle. Now, there's no nice thing about it, but we do know, the nice thing about some of this is we can predict those things. Foresters, others that are you, if you're smart enough to figure this stuff out, you can figure out whether a disturbance, like having your overstory trees start to break up and the canopy start to break up, whether that's going to cause you a problem or not, and what those problems are going to be. So we can predict a lot of this kind of thing. So, And we got plan for establishing a variety of age classes. So, and what we mean by that is, so if you've got an overstory that's starting to age and you're starting to lose some trees, let's say you have an overstory that has a lot of black oak in it. Black oak is a fairly short-lived oak species. So, man, it gets 80, 90, 100 years old, you start getting droughts, you're going to start losing those black oak overstory trees. So, and you know that's coming, okay? So you know that's an issue. If you want to maintain vigor in your overall woodlands, one way to do it is create different age classes, and by that we mean put a group opening in. Acre in size, something like that, where you cut the trees down. Maybe you do it at a timber harvest and do 15 or 20 of those scattered throughout your woodlands. That's going to open those areas up. They're going to initiate regeneration in there. So when you do that, now you've got a two-age woods. You've got a bunch of pockets that have a younger age class growing in these gaps, and then you've got your older stuff that hadn't been cut. So if your forest is big enough, you can create multiple age classes in that forest. And so that's one way to help overcome the aging effect, which leads to a decline in vigor. Okay. Now, if you're not worried about that overstory collapsing on you, so to speak, and you want to let natural processes occur, that's fine, and you can do that. But keeping multiple age classes in your woods is something that you can do to help its overall vigor. Okay. Now, we talked several different times about getting help with some of this. The concepts that we're talking about here are not hard concepts to gather in and to think about. But implementing some of this, for example, how do you know if you got native species? How do you know if you got a ground cover that's native or invasive, or what's going on there? How do you know if your tree crowns are large in the canopy are large enough or not? So there are times here where having some professional assistance helps you out. And most of you that have been involved with woodland management understand the Kentucky Division of Forestry, state agency that is responsible for providing landowners assistance with forest and woodland management, okay, is there to help you out. And they can come out, and as a part of what they do, developing a plan for your woodlands, they can advise you on forest health, and you can talk to them about these issues. And these foresters know how to assess the health of the trees and the health of the woodlands, and they can help identify if you've got any problems. And there's also the Kentucky Association for Consulting Foresters. You see the websites up there, you can get a hold of them. These are private foresters that can help landowners. They can help with timber sales and all those kind of things, but they can also help with overall woodland management. They can help you develop a plan, and they're well aware of these things as well. And then you've got the NRCS there, Natural Resource Conservation Service. Of course, this is the agency that provides a lot of farm bill money to individual woodland owners in the state for doing different forest health improvement practices. So a lot of these issues that we've been talking about, you can at times get farm bill allocation and money to improve the health, whether it's eradicate invasives, thin the woods out for get it regenerating, those kind of things. And sometimes there's times where you can get payments for that, and that's done through the NRCS. And of course, the Division of Forestry and the Association of Consulting Foresters, they know how to help you get all this done. Okay.
So before we open it up to some questions, I just wanted to draw your attention to one of the files that Billy has placed there for you, the Fern Flyer. So what Fern is the Forest Education and Research Network. And it's a group that we're just starting, trying to get together, of woodland owners who are interested in being involved in research projects, in testing out new educational materials, in kind of being part of the process of what we do in extension and scientific research for better understanding woodland health and what's going on in our woodlands. And if that sounds like something you'd be interested in, we'd love to have you in this network. And if you're wanting to learn more about it, you can send me an email. If you want to sign up for it, send me an email, e.crocker@uky.edu. And we're hoping that this is going to be a great way to advance some of the research that we're doing with these forest health threats, as well as share knowledge across a number of different groups. So if that's something you're interested in, just shoot me an email.
So I think we've got a little bit of time And we can, if there's any questions that come in or anybody's got any questions specific to it, that fern network there is something I'd encourage everybody to get involved with. There's going to be times where, for example, we're running a research project and we need acorns or we need leaf sample, like send us 6 white oak leaves from your property. So it can really help research at times. And there will be opportunities for those that are involved in that network. We're developing we're working on a woodlands health assessment tool, which is something you can take out in the woods, got pictures in it, and you can get a health rating, if you will, for your woods. Either, whether it's is your woods really healthy, or is there a problem, or have you gone to code red and something's got to be done right away.
Yeah.
So we're going to be developing the tool, and the people that are in our network, we're going to give it to those and let them field test it for us. So there's lots of opportunities to interact, with us, and our researchers on what's going on in the woods. So really think about that. Now, you'll be hearing more about that. We'll have it, in the Kentucky Woodlands magazine, and that kind of thing. So everybody stay tuned for that, because that'll be something that's pretty good, So we got a couple questions here, and I'll read them. Say, what advice do you have, for wild grape that extend in the canopy? Okay, so wild grape is native. And it's a good soft mass species for wild turkeys. Love it. If you talk to wildlife biologists, leave every grape in the woods. Now, if you talk to people that are involved with timber production, I'm involved with timber production, it's like, oh man, get the grape out of the woods. So the answer is a little bit in between. So the bottom line is this. If you've got a few scattered grape in the woods, okay, I wouldn't worry too much about it. If you have a high quality site, soils are really good, okay, and you've got a lot of grape in the overstory, you got to be careful, because if you go to regenerate that, you go to cut that stand, regenerate, do all the things I was talking about, you can wind up with areas that will grape arbor, which will just, the wild grape will grow over, the seedlings are trying to regenerate. And so what you typically do to deal with grape is, grape is shade intolerant. Its leaves have to be in the light. If you've got wild grape that's in the top of a 60, 80, 90 foot tall tree, that grape grew up with that tree. It didn't grow up the tree. It was, when the tree was small, it was in the canopy of that tree, the crown of that tree, and it grew up with the tree. So if you cut that off, it'll try to re-sprout, but those sprouts will eventually die off because they're in the shade. Now, the seed of the grape lasts for 2 or 3 years, 4 years maybe. So generally what we tell people, if you got a lot of grape in there and you're worried about it, okay, then you can cut those stems 3 or 4 years before you're going to do a timber harvest, for example, or another forest practice that's going to in the woods or whatever, and allow those sprouts to die. They'll sprout up, they'll be in the shade, they'll die off, and the seed will die out. So that's the best way to do it. You can deal with you can use herbicides like Garlon to help you control the wild grape, but a few wild grapes, not a big deal. A lot of it could be a problem if you're regenerating. But remember, the wildlife like it, so it's not a bad thing, and it is native. Okay.
And while we're on the topic of invasives, I see someone in the chat box commented on Oriental bittersweet as another problematic invasive in this area. And the list of the ones that I mentioned, that is by no means exhaustive. There are unfortunately a lot of different invasive plants, and there will continue to be a lot of new invasive plants. So you're certainly correct. Oriental bittersweet is another one to be on people's radar.
Yeah, it certainly is, and it's really caused havoc in outside of Asheville, North Carolina, and Asheville's been a hub of Oriental bittersweet in there, and it's got out in the woods, and it really causes problems. So, so somebody was asking about beech, and we had some I guess wind or ice storm or some wind took out a bunch of beech, and they're trying to get it to grow back. And the question was, how do you encourage beech? Good luck on that. No, I'm just kidding. So beech tends to be a little bit of a slow grower. Okay, but normally it is shade tolerant. It's tolerant of shade, so it'll grow in kind of shady conditions. So if you can identify the beech trees, if they're coming up, and they should be, because beech will root sprout. So those trees that were top was knocked out of them and that kind of thing were knocked over, there's some roots in there and they will sprout back. And you ought to be able to identify those and physically control some of the other vegetation around them, so you give those little beech trees some room. So, maintaining beech in the woods shouldn't be a problem. If you got a specific question about that, because I can't answer it, I didn't answer it totally for you. Let us know. Email us. Let us know. And we can help with that. Okay. So we got some other questions coming in. Let's see. Appear to be aggressive. I'm reading this. Well, you all have really long questions here. Maybe mature oaks, vigorous, and yeah. So I mean, there's beeches, or beach is a native part of the the ecosystem. So beech is a native species. It's always been around. Some places more than others. A lot of when logging is done, and historically when logging was done at the turn of the century in 20s and 30s, 40s, 50s, they left a lot of beech in the woods, and nowadays they do. And a lot of reason is in some places it's rotten because it's got a thin bark, fire comes through, all that kind of stuff. So it tends to stay around. So you can get beech building up in the understory. Right, so you just get a whole bunch of beech. You got an oak overstory, scatter beech in it. You get a beech understory, and it can be thick enough to where it chokes other things out because it is tolerant of shade. So there are times where you need to you need to assess that, and if you've got enough beech saplings, pole-sized beech growing in your woods that is contributing to stopping other species regenerate, then you might want to remove some of that, and you can easily do that with cutting, like Ellen showed, where they cutting the stump off and then spraying it and stuff like that. So beech can be a problem. It is it is a hard mass species. It is native, so nobody's looking to eradicate it. You couldn't if you wanted to, quite probably, but it can be problematic from the standpoint of management at times. Okay. See if we got anything. You see anything else? We got any other?
Removing Osage orange from hardwood forests was the...
Yeah, so Osage orange can be a hard species to deal with. There's a couple chemicals that are pretty good on Osage orange. It is a little bit hard to kill. For those of you who know anything about it, it's hedge apple, and the wood is really hard. So you can cut it. You can kill it with a cut stump spray, that kind of thing. You can kill it with foliar spray, and there are some chemicals out there that are pretty good on Osage orange. So it's not. It can be a problem, but you also can get rid of it. Okay. And see, for timber production, why would we want beech? So for timber production, beech is not typically, it's a commercial species. It's not particularly high value. That's the only reason it could be left in the woods. Now, having said that, okay, there are markets for beech, particularly good beech. So, so you don't want to... On a good quality site, for example, you would rather, from a timber standpoint, you would rather be growing something that has more value, like a northern red oak, okay, or a black oak or a white oak compared to beech, just because of the difference in the timber value. So, it's not necessarily, it's not one of our prized species. It can grow. There are markets for it. It needs to be solid, okay. But generally, it's not one of our preferred species, and we typically don't manage for it because of that. So, anyway, that's a good question, though. I'll mention one thing real quick on the grapevine. I was trying to think, can't think quick enough. But for those of you that are involved, some of it, I'm sure there are people out there that know what crop tree release is. That's a practice where you identify an individual tree and you thin out around it, release that one tree, and so it has more room to grow. If you've got grapevines out there that are in those crop trees, of course, those are the good ones to cut. If you got trees and other trees in the woods where they're not crop trees, fine, it's no big deal. But do try to get them out of your crop trees, especially if you're going to do that practice. Because if you give more sunlight to that individual crown of that individual tree, you're also going to help the grapevine that's in it. Grapevine tends to be in black cherry a lot and in black walnut. So black walnut can be a preferred species, so that's a problem sometimes. And if you've got good black cherry, grape can be a problem in it too. So you want to take care of the grapevine in your crop trees. Okay, so let me see here. Jeff, I've been working in Boone County last couple of weeks. That's too bad. Apologize for that. I see white ash declining from EAB, but the blue ash is fine. Yeah, so blue ash is a different critter. So we know that EAB is really aggressive on white ash and green ash.
And black ash.
Yeah, so green ash is going to be a lot of times down in your river bottoms, things of that. They got more of that out in western Kentucky. So we have a lot of white ash up here and that kind of thing. Now, blue ash is a little different. And some of you that live in the bluegrass, now some people in Kentucky won't even know what blue ash is. Okay, there is such a thing as blue ash. We got every color ash there is. Blue ash is one of them. Grows here in the bluegrass. Has really big, stout, big twigs. And it is not. It seems to be that the emerald ash borer is not as aggressive on the blue ash. Doesn't mean that blue ash can't be affected by it, but you're right, and that's a great observation. It is not as aggressive on blue ash. Now, long term, I can't tell you what that means. It's not going to ignore blue ash, but we're certainly not seeing the declines in blue ash that we are white or green ash. So that's a great observation. Great observation. Got any other questions? About 7:55, so we're about out. Everybody's ready to go.
Yeah.
I think, yeah. So anyhow, so we appreciate you being with us. If you're like me, you're not smart enough to think all the good questions till you're like driving home or 2 weeks later. You can get a hold of us. Go to our website ukforestry.org. Yeah, and you can get a hold of us pretty easy. Get your questions in. And we'll try to get back to you as best we can. So we appreciate everybody hanging with us tonight, at least starting a conversation about woodland health. And it's a topic that's not going away. We're going to hear lots more about it. So stay tuned for further details. Thank you a lot and have a nice evening.